order. We come to questions to the President of COP26. We start with Richard Thompson.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the UK is working closely with Egypt and other partners to ensure that the commitments made by countries at COP26 are delivered. As the honourable gentleman knows, the UK will hold the COP presidency right up to COP27 in November, and we will continue over the remaining 4 months to urge nations to implement the promises that they made in Glasgow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The outgoing Prime Minister's commitment to taking tangible climate change action has always seemed rather suspect, and rather worryingly, the contenders to replace him seem to be even less committed, with the President himself describing the commitment in an interview with The Observer at the weekend as being lukewarm. I wonder, would he tell us who exactly he had in mind for that sobriquet?
Mr. Speaker, the first thing I'd say to him is that actually the Prime Minister has been totally resolute in pursuing the net zero agenda, and it is about delivering not just an environmental benefit but also jobs and economic growth across the country. Since he makes reference to the Conservative Party leadership, certainly from what I've seen and heard, all the three remaining contenders are fully committed to the net zero agenda.
Could my right honourable friend comment on the ability of the current structure of government to achieve the ambitious targets of the nationally determined contributions of a 68% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared with 1990?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is an issue that my right honourable friend has raised with me before, and of course it will be up to the new Prime Minister to see how they want to strengthen the structures of government. The key thing is that we deliver on the commitments that we've made. That is what we will be judged on at the next election.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The long-term effectiveness of COP26 outcomes derives, at least in part, from the credibility of pledges made in Glasgow and the serious implementation of climate policies at home, especially while we still hold the presidency. So does he share my concern that yesterday the High Court ruled that the UK's net zero strategy was unlawful because it fails to meet the government's obligations under the Climate Change Act? Is he worried about the message that sends out to other countries, and will he use his best offices to make sure that BEIS does now fulfil its obligations as it's required to do?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I obviously saw the judgment as she did. I just want to make one point on this: is that the net zero strategy itself, of course, remains government policy. That's not what's been squashed. What the judgment was about was providing information on the percentage of emissions reductions coming from individual policy elements. Of course, BEIS is looking at this and will have to respond in due course.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the COP President agree with me that the extreme hot weather this week serves as a stark reminder of the realities and danger of climate change and the need for the UK and the rest of the world to strengthen their resolve to achieve the objectives set at COP26?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. What we've seen over the last couple of days here is what very many millions of people across the world experience on a very, very regular basis. And that is why ensuring that the commitments that have been garnered internationally are actually delivered upon. But also, of course, we need to make sure that we do that ourselves.
We now come to Shudder, President. End of the band.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 2 days, we have seen that the climate emergency is here and now. Wildfires raging across our country, tracks and runways melting, schools closing, and the government underprepared. Yet some people aspiring to the highest office in the land have suggested that tackling the climate crisis is a luxury that can be delayed, an indulgence, a niche project. Such people will put the safety of our citizens at risk, they are deeply irresponsible, and they are economically illiterate. Does the COP President agree that, given the demonstrable threat we so obviously face, there is no place in serious political parties for such dangerous folly?
Mr. Speaker, as the right honourable gentleman knows, I did make an intervention at the weekend. As I've said, from what I've seen and heard, all the three remaining contenders for the leadership of the Conservative Party and to be our next Prime Minister are committed to the net zero by 2050 agenda, and actually also to the near-term policy commitments to get there. They will have an opportunity, the final two will have an opportunity to set out further details over the coming weeks.
Mr. Speaker, he was so appalled by his own leadership contest that he threatened to resign, and it is no wonder. But he says all the candidates are committed. Only this morning, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond, the front runner in the leadership race, said he will double down on the onshore wind ban because of, and I quote, the distress and disruption onshore wind causes. Mr. Speaker, what's causing distress is the worst cost of living crisis in a generation. What's causing disruption is the most extreme weather in our country's history, and onshore wind is a vital tool in tackling these crises. Yet the bizarre state of the Tory party means the former Chancellor panders to the fanatics and sides with the sceptics. Will the President now repudiate this position and condemn it for the dangerous nonsense it is?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not really in a position to repudiate anybody else's proposals. But if I may, what I would say to him is that we have a very clear plan in terms of expanding offshore wind. There's another 32 gigawatts. I will come on to that. There are another 32 gigawatts which is effectively in the pipeline. I think in terms of solving the energy security strategy, we need to keep everything on the table. There is already 14 gigawatts of onshore installed across the country, and I think where communities are positively welcoming of onshore, in return for reduced bills, that is an issue that we should keep on the table.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recent Climate Change Committee's progress report concluded that the UK government's net zero strategy contains warm words but little tangible progress, and that it isn't fully credible until the government develops contingency plans such as encouraging reduced consumer demand for high-carbon activities. It also recommends carrying out a net zero tax review to see how that might best support the transition by correcting distortions that often penalise low-carbon technologies. Does the government intend taking action on these specific recommendations, and what will the President do to ensure the next Prime Minister and Chancellor urgently act on all of the committee's recommendations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the government is looking at a response to this. Let me just make a general point, which is that I believe that the current Prime Minister has shown leadership on this issue, and the reason that these sort of policies work is if there is leadership right from the top. So what I will certainly want to see from any future Prime Minister is a laser-like focus on ensuring that we are delivering on our policies on net zero emissions, but at the same time pushing forward on more jobs, more growth, more inward investment, which we have seen coming in.
Alison Thewles.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
President.
Mr. Speaker, in June at the Bonn intersessional meeting, the Glasgow Dialogue on Loss and Damage was launched to discuss the funding arrangements for addressing loss and damage. This will continue to be a critical forum to discuss practical ways finance can be scaled up and effectively delivered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week's record-breaking temperatures across the UK show that climate change is on our doorstep, but for many of the world's poorest countries, they've been dealing with this climate crisis for years. The cost of not acting on climate change is spiralling out of control. So can I ask, what steps specifically is he taking to put Scotland's world-leading approach to funding loss and damage on the agenda for COP27?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as she knows, we did at COP26 agree a way forward in terms of the Glasgow Dialogue that took place in Bonn. I'm quite sure that the issue of loss and damage will feature highly at COP27 in whichever forum. But I would just say to her, I would make this point that actually it's vital that we support developing nations as well to make clean energy transitions, and that is actually something we are doing through the Just Energy Transition Partnerships for South Africa, but also other countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam and Senegal.
Abdul Khan.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
President.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 3 and 12 together. The Glasgow Climate Pact was a historic agreement which the United Kingdom forged amongst almost 200 countries. Our presidency year has been all about getting nations to deliver on the commitments they made at COP26 across the areas of mitigation, adaptation and finance, and we will continue this work up to COP27.
Abdul Khan.
Mr. Speaker, the heat wave this week shows the need to take serious and immediate action on climate change. The Glasgow call for a phase-out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies is one prompt way the government can swiftly work towards delivering net zero plans. Does the Minister agree that instead of fossil fuel subsidies, the government should focus on homegrown, cheap, clean energy sources that guarantee our energy security?
Mr. Speaker, the government is focusing on that, and I would just refer him to the energy security strategy that was published a few weeks ago, and actually also the recent contracts for difference auction process for offshore wind, which delivered a price for offshore wind which is almost 70% lower than in 2015 and 4 times less than the current gas price. The future has to be green energy.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our schools often set a great example in raising awareness of the climate emergency. On a recent visit to Ysgol Rhyd y Grig in my constituency, the pupils told me of their concerns around deforestation in the Amazon and about the million species at risk of extinction. We must urgently halt and reverse this loss. So will he support the call led by my honourable friends on the Shadow Front bench for a net zero and nature test to align all public spending and infrastructure decisions with our climate and nature commitments?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I make a point on forest loss, which he's raised? He will know that at COP26 we got an agreement from over 140 countries, representing over 90% of the world's forests, to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. We now need to make sure that's delivered, and we are looking at mechanisms how we can keep this particular issue on the table so that countries are seen to be delivering on their commitments on an annual basis.
Oliver Hale.
Will have been as struck by, as I was at COP26 by the plight of low-lying island nations and moved at the way in which they were trying everything they could through nature-based solutions to protect themselves. But above all, they need the large countries, the developed countries, to really make sure that they do tackle climate change. And will he redouble his efforts to persuade some of these large developed countries to do better?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. The small island developing states face a very acute climate emergency. It is putting many millions of lives and livelihoods at risk. And yes, he's absolutely right. We need every country to come forward and deliver on their commitments, but particularly the biggest emitters, the G20.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
In March, DEFRA published some excellent new targets for incineration. Will he follow through on that and make, as one of his objectives for the remainder of his presidency, a moratorium on waste incineration?
President.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, the role that I currently have is trying to corral international action. He raises an important point. I will make sure that it is raised with the appropriate department.
We now come to Shadow Minister Karen McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the Committee on Climate Change issued a scathing annual progress report warning of major policy failures and scant evidence of delivery on net zero. And this week, as we've heard, the government had to be dragged to court to be told its climate plans are so woefully inadequate they're unlawful and must be revised. What kind of leadership does this set if the country holding the COP presidency can't get its own house in order? And I know that the COP president will say that the leadership candidates have paid lip service to net zero, but can he really have any confidence that things will get any better?
Mr. Speaker, just on the issue of the net zero strategy, just to point out, the Climate Change Committee has described it as ambitious and comprehensive, and the world's most comprehensive plan to reach net zero. Obviously, I've discussed the issue with regard to the legal findings, but look, the principle is absolutely right, is that we need to do everything we can to make sure we're dealing with this issue. The last few days have been a real wake-up call for everyone in this country. It's what very, very many millions of people across the world are experiencing on a regular basis. We have to deal with this issue.
I'm very impressed. We now come to Rachel Hopkins.
Question 4, Mr. Speaker.
4.
Apologies, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 4 with questions 6 and 8. Buildings are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in our country, accounting for around 22% of total UK emissions. Energy efficiency measures are indeed a vital lever to drive down emissions, energy demand and, of course, ultimately bills as well.
Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Increasing the number of energy-efficient homes will help meet our climate targets and reduce bills. In Luton, around 70% of homes have an energy performance rating of Band D or below, and these homes are more likely to include our town's most deprived households. What discussions has the Minister had with the latest Levelling Up Housing and Community Secretary about ensuring the green retrofitting of homes is equitable so everyone can benefit from an energy-efficient home?
Mr. Speaker, the government is putting £6.6 billion available over this Parliament to improve energy efficiency, and I can tell her that nearly half of the homes in England are now rated C or above, compared to 14% in 2010. But to make the wider point, I think we do need to have an even bigger focus on energy efficiency in homes and buildings. That's also a way, as part of energy security, to drive down demand and bring down people's bills.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker. Sorry? It was grouped. Apologies, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government has had a series of failed programmes on home insulation. The Green New Deal failed, the recent Green Homes Grant Scheme failed, as the Public Accounts Committee has repeatedly reported. Does he have any confidence that government will listen and tackle this major cause of emissions, which, if it isn't tackled, will really seriously dent a target of achieving net zero by 2050?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government will, of course, respond to the report on the Green Homes Grant. I would just point out that there are elements of the Green Homes Grant, the local authority delivery element, the social housing decarbonisation fund, which have provided significant amounts of funding. But as I said, the government will respond in due course to that report.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The President will know that the bulk of buildings around today will still be around in 2030 and in 2050. Most of those are grossly inadequately insulated. Even new buildings are not being built to an acceptable standard. When are we going to see some action on this critical agenda?
Mr. Speaker, I've set out the amount of funding the government's providing over this Parliament on £6.6 billion on energy efficiency. But I very much share the view that actually we need to be doing even more on this, particularly at a time where energy security and energy prices are so high. More insulation in homes is going to deliver lower bills for households.
Jacob Young.
Mr. Speaker, on energy efficiency, decarbonising in-home heating remains one of the biggest challenges to net zero 2050. So will you join me in welcoming plans for a hydrogen village by 2025? And will you have a chat with the BEARS Secretary and encourage him to back our plans for one in Redcar and Cleveland?
President.
Mr. Speaker, I know that my honourable friend is a great champion of green energy, but particularly hydrogen in his area. I wish him luck with the plans, and of course I will raise this matter with the Business Secretary.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, as has been pointed out, previous programmes to improve insulation in homes, either by this party or the Labour Party, have not delivered what any of us would have hoped. But does my right honourable friend agree that if this was targeted effectively at the homes who suffer most, many of which are also going to be paying unacceptable increases in their energy bills, this could be a very effective way of both improving insulation, reducing energy and improving energy efficiency?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. This is a measure that will deliver lower bills but also reduce the demand for energy at this critical point where energy security is so important around the world and also in our country.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, one of the ways we could improve energy efficiency is ensuring that new homes that are built are energy efficient. Will my right honourable friend make pressure on developers to ensure they're called to modern efficiency standards rather than the old ones?
President.
Mr. Speaker, having modern, up-to-date standards is of course vitally important, and I will make sure that I raise this with the appropriate department.
Now comes topicals, John Penrose.
Topicals, Mr. Speaker. Topical number 1.
Mr. Speaker, on this day I want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend the Prime Minister for his domestic for his domestic and international leadership on the issues of tackling climate change and biodiversity loss. He's championed both during his time as Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, and he charmed, he cajoled and he corralled his international counterparts to ensure that over 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero targets. Under his premiership, the UK forged the historic Glasgow Climate Pact, bringing together almost 200 countries, and he has been the driving force to deliver a net zero emissions economy. He's championed the creation of well-paid green jobs, bringing in billions of pounds of private sector investment in the UK. In all of these areas, he leaves a legacy to be proud of.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, is my right honourable friend aware of the Whitetail project in Teesside, where an alum cycle electricity generating plant will burn either gas or coal in pure oxygen with zero carbon emissions? Would you agree with me that projects like this ought to be fully compatible not only with our net zero commitments but also with improved energy security, and could therefore form a long-term and permanent part of our future energy generating needs?
President.
Mr. Speaker, I am indeed aware of this project, and he will also know that the UK government's innovation funding has supported development of the alum cycle power generation technology. Since 2012, almost £5 million has been provided to fund R&D and £1.3 million for technical studies.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you. The President well knows that tackling the cost of living crisis and also achieving net zero go hand in hand. But will the President go further and endorse a Green New Deal that brings together job creation, social justice, alongside tackling climate change?
Mr. Speaker, as a government, we have a significant number of policies which are delivering. What we need to make sure is that we double down on this. As I've said, at the next general election, we will be judged on these policies and whether we have delivered.
Please return to them. Jude Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that net zero should be achieved through rolling out low-carbon technology and scientific solutions, such as the gene editing bill, rather than measures that dampen economic growth and depress living standards?
My honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right. The green technologies and innovations is what is going to help us achieve the net zero target. He makes reference to gene editing. I can also reference the recent CFD auction, which has delivered record renewables capacity in the country.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, well-insulated homes protect against extreme heat as well as extreme cold, while reducing energy demand, cutting bills, emissions and fossil fuel imports. So why are the government delaying their National Eco4 programme, with some households potentially missing out?
As I pointed out to her, there is a significant amount that the government is doing in terms of energy efficiency. Of course, we should always look to see what more that can be done.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend outline the discussions that he's had with his colleagues in government so as to act on the Climate Change Committee's recommendation of the need for further support, which is aligned to net zero, so as to help people with their energy bills?
President. Mr. Speaker, as he knows, support is being provided to help households, particularly the most vulnerable households will receive at least £200 worth of support. Of course, we also need to look at further energy efficiency measures, and I'm sure the new Prime Minister and Chancellor will look at all of this.
Luke Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the court found that the government's net zero strategy was unlawful because it only included 95% of the emissions reductions required to meet the sixth carbon budget, and by not including the detail required to enable Parliament to properly scrutinise it. So what will the Minister do to rectify this, and which aspects of the strategy will he be strengthening now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said in response to an earlier question, the net zero strategy is not what has been quashed, and obviously the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy will look to respond on the judgment that's been made.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I commend my right honourable friend for his amazing service as COP26 President? And can I ask him to make it his objective to ban the sale of Chinese lanterns across the UK? Across our tinder dry land, they are simply acting as unguided flamethrowers.
President,
well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her kind comments. With regard to these lanterns, I will make sure this is raised with the appropriate department domestically.
The President
President showed great leadership at COP26, which we all respect him for. Can I ask him to do the same again and cut back on a project that's polluting both his and my constituents' lungs? Could he please revisit the biggest emitter of CO2 in the whole of Europe and think again about a new runway at Heathrow?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my role, as you know, as COP President, is to corral the international community. She's raised the question, and I'm sure the Department of Transport will respond.
Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the dramatic increase in fuel prices presents opportunities for decarbonising fleets of vehicles in key sectors such as social care?
Well, it's very good.
President.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point, and of course decarbonising the transport sector along with other sectors should be a key priority going forward.
Murray Gardner.
The recent carbon tracker report set out for each financial sector across the world its exposure to stranded assets, over 1 trillion in total. Will the COP President be engaging with each of the heads of the financial sectors like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the London Stock Exchange, to ensure that they cope with that problem?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the private sector is actually very focused on the issue of the move to net zero, and as you will know, in Glasgow, $130 trillion of assets signed up to net zero. Anyone investing in assets which might end up being stranded has to be very clear about the financial decisions they're taking.
Jerome Mayo.
Does my right honourable friend agree that establishing a price for carbon would give the free market the signal it needs to invest in low-carbon alternatives across the economy? Does he also agree that a carbon border adjustment mechanism is a necessary first step to achieve that?
Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend has raised this issue before, and of course tackling carbon leakage is a vital issue. As my honourable friend is aware, Her Majesty's Treasury will be launching a consultation later this year and setting out a range of carbon leakage mitigation options, which includes looking at a carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Barry Sherman.
Am I allowed to say to the Minister that many of us on these benches think he's done a darn good job? But will he make every effort, if he survives the present wranglings in the Conservative Party, will he come back and grassroot what we're trying to do about climate change in every community and every town and city and community? Let's have 500 sustainable towns and cities in this country. Does he agree with that?
Mr. Speaker, in the words of Gloria Gaynor, I will survive. But can I just say, Mr. Speaker, that the point he raises is that tackling the climate emergency is an issue for all of us, for governments, for civil society and individuals, and we all need to play our part.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions,